you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Duivestein. I'm one of the transportation engineers at Parsons who's been working with the city on the False Creek Flats Arterial, and I've got my colleague Cato in the audience as well, who assisted with these cost estimates. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is a little bit about how costs are estimated in planning studies such as these. What are the key types of costs or cost elements that are incorporated into the estimates, and lastly, review the range of costs that were estimated for each of the options. So beginning with how costs are estimated. Cost estimation is a process, not a single one-time activity, and cost estimates are continuously updated throughout the course of engineering design. So right now we are at the conceptual design or planning phase, and industry associations such as the Canadian Construction Association, the Association of Consulting Engineering Companies of BC, and Engineers and Geoscientists of BC provide a lot of guidance on the level of precision of estimates relative to the level of design detail that is available. So right now we are at the Class D level, just because we have some fairly high-level designs, and we know there's a lot of uncertainties and unknowns in each of these estimates, and as a result of that, the potential for variation in the cost estimate is greater. As the design is refined and becomes more detailed over time, then the level of confidence and certainty in the estimates increase, and that variation can be reduced. Some of the types of unknowns at the planning level that can influence uncertainty in cost estimation include the scope of the project. So right now, I think you've all seen the drawings that have been produced and form the basis of the estimates. If there's changes to the scope, for example, if there's additions to create improvements to nearby or adjacent streets added to the scope of the project, that changes the costs. We're also working with limited site information in terms of topography or soil conditions, where all of this has been subject to some review, but there's been no drilling at each of these alignments to sort of fully understand soil conditions, for example, so we've had to make a number of assumptions about what sort of mitigation measures would be required there. And as Steve touched on, rate fluctuations in construction materials, labor, property costs can all change over time as the schedule gets delayed and can have the potential to escalate. So our approach right now is we work with the level of design that we have available. We make a number of assumptions based on judgment and experience with similar past projects where we've run into some similar types of considerations, and then we apply some contingencies to the estimate to account for some of the unknowns. So the primary way we do this is we take the drawings, we divide them up into all their little constituent elements, so amount of road area that requires paving, the extent of subsurface utility relocations, for example, the amount of retaining wall that needs to be built, and we quantify each and every one of those elements. We then apply unit costs to each of them to how much the prevailing rate is to construct, say a square meter of retaining wall, for example. We add up, and then we then sum all those up, and then we add in some soft cost factors for things like project management, engineering costs, to translate our estimate from a construction cost estimate into an overall project cost estimate. One of the things we do also look at is comparisons with completed projects, just as a bit of a reasonableness check of the estimate. However, I'll just add as a caveat that that does require a lot of care, because sometimes reference projects are not actually as similar as they first appear to be. And so just to re-emphasize, cost estimates are subject to change, and these are the best estimates available, the information we have at the time, but we anticipate that as design progresses, there are continued revisions to estimates. However, they are useful for decision making. They provide an order of magnitude cost for each of these options, and also provide information on some of the relative cost differences between the options. And lastly, what we haven't presented here, but is important to consider, is also the life cycle, operations, maintenance, and rehabilitation cost of all the infrastructure. It's one thing to build it, but it's going to exist for 50 or 100 years, so there's ongoing costs for each of these options as well. In terms of types of costs, we've broken things down primarily into construction costs and land acquisition and property mitigation, each of which has several subcategories, and I will run through each of these. So roadway costs are all our surface roadways. We have sort of all the different types of roadway elements on the left. It also includes subsurface elements such as drainage, utilities, all that sort of stuff that's not necessarily seen, but if it needs to be added or relocated as part of the roadway, then that's all part of these cost estimates. For the overpass and underpass options on Prior Street, we'd be largely looking at retaining the existing arterial road with some upgrades, whereas for the Malkin, William and National options, there is an extensive amount of new roadway construction involved. Certainly along National and Malkin Street, we reuse some of the existing roadway wherever possible, but there are upgrades required to those existing road sections as well. The arterial overpass structure is a significant component of the overall project costs. And we've looked at most of these options have overpasses. So an overpass will typically have a superstructure, which includes the deck, which is the driving surface or that you're actually traveling along, the girders or other form of structural support that hold everything up in place in the spans. A substructure, which will consist of foundations, that'll be sort of piles, for example, that are drilled down into the ground to provide stability for the structure in the unstable soil conditions. Piers are the bridge columns that hold it up, and abutments, so that's at either end of the structure where it ties into the approach ramps. We have abutment walls at the end of the structure. And then lastly, the approaches themselves will have retaining walls, just because we're constrained in this area, so we don't have those big slopes that you may see off to the side of some of the highway ramps, for example. And lightweight fill, just because of the ground conditions, we'd be looking at adding some lightweight materials to hold that up. The structure sizes and lengths do vary quite a lot between these options, as you can see on the bottom right there. And although we haven't identified any specific structure types, there are some key considerations that influence what type of structures are feasible for each option, including the length, overall length, the length of the maximum span, and the some depth constraints for the height or thickness of the structure. And what those depth constraints, where they come into play is with what are called clearance envelopes, or basically the amount of space that has to be provided underneath the structure. Okay. So we got a number of different types of constraints. So for example, rail requires 7 meters of vertical clearance, and that's based on a Transport Canada requirement. So all of these structures span the rail yard or rail corridor with a minimum height of 7 meters above the existing ground. Roads, we typically provide roughly 5 meters of clearance, so that can accommodate trucks. Roads, unlike rail, can be adjusted up or down by a meter or two to help optimize the design a little bit. Walking and cycling, we typically be providing in the range of 3 meters. We are also constrained by maximum road grades, so where this comes into play, especially for walking and cycling or people with other mobility challenges, providing a road that's not so steep that it becomes very difficult or challenging to use is also a constraint. To provide a bit of a sense of the comparison of the size of the structures, we've got the existing Powell Street overpass at the top, and then the structures for all the other options shown down below. So you can see, for example, the Prior Street overpass is roughly the same size as the existing Powell overpass, whereas all the other structures spanning the rail yards are quite a lot larger, and National, actually, there's little break lines there you may notice extends beyond the edge of the projector screen. Another key consideration for constructability is ground conditions and what that means for foundation design. So as you may know, False Creek Flats used to be a tidal mud flat that has been filled in, and what that means is there's a lot of marine deposit and fill at the top layers of soil, and that creates some challenging ground conditions where you need to go down quite far in some cases before you hit some more stable soils. So what that means, I've got sort of an estimate on the left there from our geotechnical review, but what this generally means is the further south the alignment, the more unstable the soils and the deeper the foundations have to be before you get to competent soils that are stable for foundations. Construction complexity is another key challenge. So building over an active rail yard is not a straightforward task, and there's a number of challenges there in terms of coordination with railway to ensure that operations can continue or otherwise be coordinated with construction of a new structure. Typically, overpasses are generally easier to build and coordinate than an underpass. Some of the other considerations for the prior underpass in particular include groundwater and rainwater drainage. So one of the components that applies both to capital costs and ongoing maintenance costs is the need for a pumping station, similar to the one shown on the left there to drain the underpass and ensure it's not flooded. The Adanak bikeway structure has the same type of constraints that the main structure has in terms of vertical clearances for all the different types of modes, as well as grades or approach slopes where we try and keep them relatively as flat as possible in order to improve accessibility for people walking and cycling. So for the purposes of the estimation, the prior street options include a incorporated walking and cycling facility, whereas all the other options include an additional separate structure either along Union Street or Prior Street. Next, I'll talk a little bit about property. So, one of the key property elements that comes into play is right-of-way acquisition. So in some cases, the road right-of-way is too narrow, or is wide enough, but it's not necessarily exactly where the road alignment is proposed. So in those cases, additional, private property would need to be acquired to provide the road right-of-way. So private property acquisition is a complex process involving discussions and negotiations with each and every one of the property owners that would be impacted. In some cases, where property is partially required but not the full site, then that may require building modifications or other changes in order to maintain the functionality of the remaining parcel of property. So an example of this is the commercial Broadway SkyTrain station, which if anyone's been there recently, you may have noticed a lot of construction where the back end of the Safeway has been removed to make space for a new platform. So that's an example of a building modification, and the loading bay there for that site was also renovated to allow produce deliveries to still happen while providing space for the additional SkyTrain station infrastructure. I will now pass it over to Doug to talk about some of the park impact mitigation.
Thanks. The park mitigation, the aspects of park mitigation from the impacts of the options include replacement costs for amenities impacted, so anything such as a track or a field house, or environmental assets as well, or ecological assets, would have to be replaced. Any trees that are lost would have to be replaced, and replacement and compensation means there's only so big a tree that you can plant, and that has a cost, but there's also a compensation value for large mature trees. If they come out, they have a value attached to them that's far greater than the tree that goes in to replace them, so that would be factored in. Planning and design costs associated with any park replanning and redesign because of a reconfiguration due to an option. Construction costs for affected park space outside of alignment boundaries. So the impact on a park would not only be the chunk of the park that may be taken to go towards one of the options, but of course the adjacent piece of the park to that, especially if there's a grade change, has an effect on the function of the park that remains. So there's some mitigation that has to happen outside of the boundary of the alignment, and that varies from alignment to alignment. Some are minor, some are major. And lastly, and the largest piece of the cost of park mitigation in every option is land acquisition, in almost every option. And that is basically finding land, paying for land that would replace area for area the land lost, and also that the land is capable of providing the same park and recreation services as the land that's been lost. I'll give it back to Jared.
Thank you. And lastly, just to go over the resultant cost estimates for each of the options. So this is for everything except the park impacts. This is all the construction and all the land. So I think the kind of the key takeaways here are Melton, William, and National all generally have higher road costs because there's a greater extent of road construction or reconstruction compared to some of the modifications to the existing Fire Street alignment. The overpass structure costs generally increase in proportion to the size of the structure. So, you know, the Melton, William, and National ones, because we're spanning so many more tracks, the costs there tend to be higher. On the land acquisition and property impact mitigation side, you know, the Melton, William, and National ones, again, because we have a greater extent of property impacts, there's higher cost estimates there, including along National, the costs for relocating some of the works yard and fire training facilities are fairly significant and one of the key considerations there. And, you know, summing all those up is how we get our total anticipated cost ranges for each of the options. And then, Doug, did you want to touch a little bit on the park costs?
Thanks, Jared. So the park costs, their ranges like the rest of the costs to indicate that they're order of magnitude planning costs. And basically they break down into broad categories of park acquisition, which you can see generally is the largest cost, and then park mitigation, which are the other things that I mentioned for total cost, total park costs. They rank a little differently than the overall costs excluding park costs, but when these park costs are added in to the overall costs, they don't change the ranking of the overall costs of the options, if that makes sense. So when you add these costs, and I don't think we have a spreadsheet that shows this, but when you add these total park mitigation costs to the overall costs in the slide before, the cost ranking of the options doesn't change. In other words, you have the park costs in, they have their own ranking, but they're comparatively minor enough that they don't change the ranking of the overall options. So if we can go back to that slide, Jared. Yeah, and just a few anomalies here. The Malkin range is quite a big range because in terms of park mitigation, the Malkin South option affects very little of throughout the park, whereas the Malkin North option affects quite a large chunk of Malkin Park. And that's it.
All right, and last slide, so just to reemphasize, these are order of magnitude costs that are intended for planning purposes. They reflect the best information available at the time, but there's lots of things still to be refined as the design progresses for each and any one of these options, but they're useful for understanding rough costs and relative differences in costs between options. Thank you.